when you look at the covert intelligence community's USAPs, you have to divide them into two general areas. You have advanced physics, and these are things that you can think of that are very 3D, 4D, you know, ARVs, electromagnetic devices, programmed life forms that are robotic creatures that are bio-nano genetics. By the way, the state-of-the-art lab for that is Dulce. Cannot get to it by being anywhere near Dulce. There's a connector from Los Alamos underground and also some other UGVs. We'll get into that in a moment, where the underground system is connected. But these are the ones that are really where the action is. Transdimensional physics, both passive and active. Now, the reason I divide these into passive and active systems is that the passive systems are for intelligence gathering and spycraft. The active systems are for disruption and staging things. Does that make sense? So as we look at these passive systems, you're looking at the sort of things that if you were to develop electromagnetic interdimensional spycraft, and it's way past PRISM or the Monroe Institute. When I say way past, way past. PRISM was the Snowden revealed NSA eavesdropping thing. Those are using electromagnetic linear. And these are systems that, as I mentioned, have electromagnetic assisted remote viewing into the conscious realm. And those allow spycraft to take place free of any tap or electromagnetic monitoring of telecommunication, what's called signals intelligence. Not necessary. And this is why everyone who works with me, when they first start working with me, they go, oh, we need to send everything encrypted, and we need this, and I said, don't bother. By the time the thought has left your cerebral cortex, it's been grabbed by these technologies. Now, one of my military advisors for many years was a naval commander, and he, back when the White Oaks Naval Facility was operative, it's closed now in Maryland, he saw a device that was called a white noise space-time electromagnetic extraction system. And what that was is that it was a device that could target anywhere, any volume of space, say the volume in this room, and say the device is there near Bethesda in Maryland. They could target the volume of this room and monitor anything going on now or that happened here last night, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago. It's called the white noise of space-time. The mystics call it the Akashic record. So encoded within the fabric of space-time is everything that has ever happened is still there as a standing energy waveform that can be extracted by this system. And that was in the 70s, and it had been fully operational long before he got there. Called the white noise space-time extraction. Okay, do you understand what that is? So yeah, so it can target it, but it's actually pulling events and information and intelligence out of the structure of space-time and can target any volume anywhere. So this is why I say, you know, Snowden, I told his lawyers, don't, he made a very big mistake disclosing lame stuff like PRISM and the conventional NSA fiber optic going into Google and Facebook. The big action is this stuff. And that's why anyone who wants to work with me, I say, forget about encryption. Forget about secrecy. Ain't going to work, because if you had $1 trillion, you couldn't frustrate these systems. Now, and then there are others that have been developed or they're trying to develop, so-called Project Red Light. That's based on studying extraterrestrial communication devices that can also look into the future or get a sense of future events. Those are in development and are less precise, but that's only because all future events are only probabilities. So let me explain what I mean by that. Everything that we think and do at this moment is changing the future. And so if in this point in time you see an event in the future, by the time you've seen it, if you've shared that information, it can change that event. Does this make sense? So now, it may have a 95% likelihood, it may have a 99%, it may be a 80%, but it's not going to be 100%. The ones looking in the real time now or backward, like the white noise extraction systems, those are extremely accurate. Okay, so those are all passive systems that, and there are many others, that have been developed since the 50s, 60s, 70s. Certainly by the 60s and 70s, these were all fully operational. Okay, so you're not going to learn this in your physics class or your government class at the college here, but you'll learn it today, and I'm telling you the truth. Now, these are worrisome just because they're very unacknowledged special access project spy systems. These are where my bigger concern is. And these active transdimensional systems deal with the ability to perturb or induce phenomenon from other realms and dimensions. I mentioned that a moment ago, where they could set up an electromagnetic vector into another dimension and cause a phenomenon to take place that would not only fool everyone, but could be very injurious to the Earth. One of these systems, I've been told, recently has been deployed in the past to be set up over certain tectonic fault lines to induce earthquakes and earth changes. And these are actively being deployed. Very dangerous game being played. This is why these events coming are going to be not just natural, but man-made and natural. Keep that in mind as things start unfolding. They're in the hands of some of the worst elements possible, which is why I said 25 years ago, the disclosure of this subject and getting these technologies under the control of conscious, ethical people is of the utmost importance to the human future, and it is an existential crisis that it is in the hands of the people it's in. They have had the ability to do teleportation since the 50s, maybe 40s. You've all heard the Philadelphia experiment. It wasn't actually in Philadelphia, it was in Rhode Island, but that was a cover story. But the long story short is the ability to cause an object to switch and fall out of one point in space and appear at another. That has been done fairly recently with particles in physics. It's been reported in mainstream physics journals. But what you need to know is through very high voltage and electromagnetic frequency field systems, it began to be studied and practiced and experimented with in the 40s and 50s. One of our disclosure project witnesses, Fred Threadfell, was up at a base up in Canada that was a classified Air Force facility where they had this big room, and it sounds so prosaic, but they had an ashtray. And the ashtray would be on a box, and it had this electromagnetic field, and it would dematerialize and rematerialize on another part of the base, and they could just teleport it back and forth. An ashtray. That was in 1953. So these sort of sciences, transdimensional physics and sciences, have been developed over the last 60, 70 years. At this point in 2018, they're extraordinarily well developed in the classified world, and they can stage pretty much anything they want, which is what they're doing. It also means they can materialize and dematerialize objects. They can weaponize these interdimensional portals, or so-called stargates. Now, this is the thing that is most concerning to me, is that all interstellar extraterrestrial civilization are crossing through these finer dimensions to get here. They're not going through linear solid space-time. But over the last 30, 40 years, they've developed the ability to weaponize, say, a vector or a portal into these other dimensions and then create a weapon system that can target other starcraft, other planetary systems, and what have you. This is very dangerous in the hands of people who have the intention to utilize them. And this is of great concern. to all of us. The other are the satellite-based systems. Back in the 70s, I met the man who was a very brilliant electromagnetic engineer, had his own company in the Tampa, St. Pete area, who had developed what he called a neutrino light detector. These are detectors that are placed on satellites that can pick up an ET craft when it's coming out of interdimensional, transdimensional space-time into this dimension, and it leaves a certain signature. And it's not conventional light. It's a neutrino kind of light scatter, but in the shape and form and vector of the spacecraft. That is then slaved, as they call, to weapon systems that are both in space on satellites and on the ground to target the ET craft and hit it with a very powerful electromagnetic weapon, which is how we've been causing these crash retrieval events to happen. Though you're not going through billions of miles or light years of space and getting here and running out of gas and crashing. I mean, or an electrical storm. They don't know how to maneuver through our 737s can go around electrical storms. They're being targeted with these weapons that are faster than the speed of light because they are what are called scalar or longitudinal. So a quick study in that. Wave, like light you're seeing, has a wave function, right? So the wave function is 186,000 miles per second propagating. Scalar or longitudinal, it's a point in a line, and it doesn't have a wave function, and it is multiples of the speed of light. Those scalar systems or longitudinal systems have been developed since the 40s, 50s, 60s and have been weaponized. That was what was in the little secret radar dome. The FBI memo that we got has now become the #1 viewed document on the FBI website from the field agent to J. Edgar Hoover about the Roswell event, where it says apparently they switched on a, quote, new radar system and these things crashed. It wasn't radar the way you think of radar at Denver International Airport. That term radar, just so you know, is a euphemism used in unacknowledged special access projects to denote these sort of specialized pulsed electromagnetic weapon systems. And they call them radar. It's a euphemism. So these have been developed and were deployed in the 70s. There were systems in the 60s that were present in space, but they weren't as accurate because they didn't have these very subtle neutrino light detectors on them. And of course, then you have the land, air, and sea-based systems that aren't in space that have these interdimensional and scalar electromagnetic weapons. A good example would be near Eglin Air Force Base. There's an area of beach there that's classified, and they have these big horseshoe-shaped objects that are connected to satellite tracking systems. And when they have picked up ET craft coming in, they'll switch it on and hit it with the equivalent of something much more powerful than an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, like you'd get from a nuclear weapon, but it's very directional, and it will disable the ET craft, and it'll drop straight out of the sky into the Gulf, and they'll go and retrieve it. I know people who've been on those retrieval teams. What? Yeah. You now understand why the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the 3-star general I met with, in the first 10 minutes said, "Dr. Greer, we don't know why you haven't committed suicide yet." That was his first question. Why haven't you? And then there are the mind-conscious interface weapons. These are ones, that get into radionic, psychotronic disruptors. Very worrisome, because if you take, the concept of technology interfacing with mind and consciousness, and you were to weaponize it, then you can create a system that not only gathers intelligence, but disrupts people's function or level of consciousness, or can induce, as I mentioned earlier, hallucinogenic abduction states. But also, importantly, can disrupt amity, can disrupt relationships. There was a woman back in 93 or 94 who I met with for about a week, who had worked in one of these corporations. And she says, look, we have devices, and we can turn a dial, target a board meeting in New York City, and have the board come to the decision we want them to come to. Or we can turn the dial the other way. Everyone in the room is fighting with each other, hating each other. The egos come out. And these are very well-developed systems. Sounds like tinfoil hat stuff. And that's what they want you to believe. But those systems have been fully operational also since the 50s and 60s. So this is just sort of a quick overview of the constellation of types of technologies. I think you're getting the gist of this. Everything you've learned is wrong about this subject. Most of it is stagecraft. You have to have this information to go to the next level of what you need to do, and that's to become an interplanetary ambassador to these civilizations. Because I don't think it's going to happen out of the U.S. State Department or the UN anytime soon. And it is very important that you not give any power to this, but you have to be aware of it. So this is very important for you to understand as a sort of milieu, sort of the prevailing environment that is extant. It's out there, it's operational, it's fully operational, and it's being deployed all the time. It's the stock and trade of most things ufological. So I think we have to begin to, and I had someone say to me once, well, you're really a skeptic about most. I said, no, it's not a skepticism, it's about knowledge. I've known all of this since the early and mid-90s. Terrible. Well, and of course, what do you do when you're meeting with a politician? And I had dinner night before last, before I flew out here, with one of the main editor of Politico and a former ambassador under Bill Clinton and some people in D.C. I have a home in D.C. and I meet with a lot of these kind of folks. And you're trying to bring them up to ET and UFO 101, that they even exist. But they need to know this. But they don't. And it's a huge learning curve. It's vertical. And all of us have got to go through this learning curve very quickly so we don't get fooled again. Imagine this constellation of technologies being deployed to simulate an alien attack, simulate abductions, mutilations, and as Dr. Altshuler, who is a wonderful man who lived here in Denver, I'd stay at his home, and he was remember the Snippy the horse, the original mutilated animal thing? That was him. That was the doctor who researched that in the late 68 or something. He says, oh yeah, I discovered those were covert paramilitary programs doing those back in the late 60s. Nobody would listen. I said, oh yeah, of course they are. We know how they're doing it and why they're doing it. It's really funny. Everyone said, the aliens are mutilating the cattle. I said, oh, yeah, right. I know exactly who's doing it, where they're operating out of, what technologies they're using, and they've been doing it since the 60s. Now, to the hysterical public, the aliens are mutilating our cattle and women folk, and they're doing this and they're doing that. I'm going, yeah, well, they're alien, but they're not extraterrestrial. Go back to the previous slide, and you'll see alien is a catch-all. So what part of this is extraterrestrial? What part of it is interdimensional? What part of it innately interdimensional? And what part of it is man-made simulators using very advanced technologies that who knows how many trillions of dollars, at least 8 trillion in one Michigan State University study recently, $21 trillion in covert money have gone into. Our entire national debt, by the way, would be all set if we could claw back the 21 trillion that have been embezzled into these projects. Yeah. So it's a lot of money. And with it comes a lot of technology and a lot of brilliant people. The smartest people I have ever met on this planet that are not ET have been people who have been identified in high school and college and pulled into a USAP, Unacknowledged Special Access Project. IQ's 200 and north. I mean, just geniuses. And what a waste. Because they're spending their lives working for these fascists who have an agenda of World War III being interplanetary, just as Wernher von Braun warned on his deathbed. So if you take all of this in the aggregate and realize that people say, when is the false flag going to happen? I said, well, that started in the 50s. The false flag operators started in the 50s when they developed alien reproduction vehicles, gravity control, then started doing stagecraft simulating ET encounters that scared people, et cetera and so on, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s till now. It's all been part of an acculturation and brainwashing and counterintelligence so that people, when they're ready to hit the button, bang, would say, we'll be convinced that whatever that is an actual hostile alien invasion. That's the basis of it. I always say what all this boils down to is integrity, and courage. And you gotta have both. And the courage is a lot to ask for from a politician. Never mind integrity. But they know that, the people who are on the Majority Intelligence Committee that handles all this. There are dozens and dozens of unacknowledged special access projects that deal with this. They are sort of silos. For example, the gentleman who recently came forward, he was given baseline clearance, it's called, across 18 of them. But there, out of 6,000 people, there were only 3 people that had baseline clearance across them. So they're usually very, very compartmented, isolated. One of the things that he shared with me, which was very interesting, is the fact that there's a facility near Lawton, Oklahoma, near Fort Sill, where there's an underground base that has these, one of the spacecraft that was downed apparently in the 80s or 90s, that is being studied to figure out how it cloaks. And he has seen that facility. There's also a facility that where we downed an ET craft outside Seoul, South Korea, and they had to bore a huge facility into a mountain, and there's an ET craft there. There's a facility in Irvine, California that looks like an office park, but you go way underground, and there's a facility where they're studying the extraterrestrial bodies. There's all kinds of facilities and operations, some of which I knew about and some I did not. And what was fascinating to me is that this man had been in the Army as a career person, retired, and then got rehired as a civilian, and then, and only then, was read into these projects, and he didn't even know what an unacknowledged special access project was. But when he saw this movie, he went, this man knows what he's talking about. So he was pulled into what's called the TMO, Technology Management Office of the Pentagon. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a couple of this is by no means comprehensive. I just wanted to give you an idea of where some of these facilities are, and kind of where they're, how they're structured. There's an entire Edwards base and related facilities on the left here, Edwards Air Force Base in the high desert of California. And you have these various, Haystack Butte is a specific place that has an underground facility underneath that, China Lakes. George Norton has been decommissioned, Tabletop Mountain, and Blackjack Control. Interesting, Blackjack Control is at Edwards. The top secret document that's the National Reconnaissance Office, which is the office that runs all the super secret spy satellites, mentions Blackjack operation, but Blackjack Control, and that's out of Nellis, so-called Area 51, although it's not really called Area 51. But Blackjack Control is actually at the Edwards facility. Now, what you need to know is that you can go into an underground connector at Edwards, and I know people who have done this in their jobs, connect to an underground tunneling system and surface at Nellis. All right? So Bing. Bechtel Corporation, I'll mention, there's a nuclear-powered tunneling device that bores through solid bedrock and glassifies it, and then they put these high-speed electromagnetic transport systems in. So people can go underneath the surface of the Earth at one point and appear at another point in the continental United States. It was sort of honeycombed with a number of these tunnels and underground facilities. One thing to keep in mind, nothing that is mission critical is on the surface of the Earth. It is either underground or in space. If it's above a nuclear blast zone, surface of the Earth, or an asteroid hit level of the surface of the Earth, it is not critical. Or if it's critical, it's got a mirror facility underground. That's what the COG is, continuity of government. You know what that is? COG? No. You know, if a nuclear weapon went off and took out the whole government in Washington, there's a continuously running system. It used to be in Mount Weather, and it's near there now. So, and then you have aerospace facilities that are at Edwards. You have the Northrop's Ant Hill Teton Ranch, McDonnell Douglas Llano plant, Lockheed Martin Hellendale plant, Phillips Lab. These are all facilities where ARVs, so-called alien reproduction vehicle, man-made flying saucers and triangles are made. You all have heard of the Nellis complex. It's called Area 51, but it's actually areas S4, S12. Pahut Mesa and Area 19 are key. Pahut Mesa is a mesa, and underneath is where the state-of-the-art research lab is studying extraterrestrial materials are located, and Groom Lake, the test range out on that Area 51 site. It's really called the Nevada Test Range. In New Mexico, you have Los Alamos National Laboratories. They have a compartmented operation that deals with this, but more importantly, a member of my team for many years was a senior engineer at Los Alamos, and he was in the locker room, and he was hearing some men talk about the fact they had just come back out of Dulce through the underground connector. So Los Alamos has an underground connector system to the Four Corners area. Now, a lot of people have gone there, like UFO hunters, and they go, there's nothing there on the ground. Well, no, there isn't. There's no egress, there's no access, there's no regress. It's all through underground elsewhere. But it's in that area. And that's where a lot of the PLFs are made, programmed life forms, the so-called aliens, the ones that are running around. It's where we grow them, is out there. Anyway, so that's the Los Alamos and Dulce complexes. You have Kirkland Air Force Base, of course, has had a historic connection, but Sandia National Lab specifically has studied this issue. And the Phillips Lab facility, Manzano Mountain Weapons Storage Facility is underground. Coyote Canyon test site, and then of course, White Sands is actually a separate New Mexico facility. White Sands is its own facility, quite far away from Kirkland. That was graphic was a little mistaken there. Go to the next slide, and I'll show you some more. Is this interesting to spy on all these? In Arizona, I've had some people, a couple people, a recent man just contacted us who had worked at that facility. Years ago, a gentleman who had been in the underground facility there had worked in the compartmented operation where there were 9 separate ET spacecraft that over the years had been down, taken there, and then they had an underground morgue for all the ET bodies, all the ETs that we had, of course, killed, and were in storage there. So that Fort Huachuca is actually also an NSA facility in a Fort Huachuca, Arizona. It's near Tombstone, ironically. All these dead ETs and craft there. It's also Army Intelligence Headquarters. It's at Fort Huachuca, way out in the desert. And there are others, of course, out in this Cheyenne Mountain. The Colorado Deep Space Network here in Colorado has a significant research. And there's an Air Force base connected underground out further east. I'm blocking on the name. Yeah, Schroeder. That is very connected to this program. You have the Lawrence Livermore Labs in California, Pine Gap facility in Australia. They're both magic and Australian, but it's really run by U.S. I was at a briefing with 120 world leaders on an island in the Great Barrier Reef about 5 years ago, and this Minister of Defense for Australia was there, and he was very curious Because the mistake people make is that, oh, he's the Minister of Defense of Australia, he'd know everything going on in his backyard. No, he doesn't, because these are unacknowledged special access projects that he was not read into. So it was a very interesting series of conversations. And by the way, it's very disturbing. I mean, if you're the Minister of Defense or the President or Prime Minister or CIA Director, and you find out that there's this enormous and most important technological and strategic activity in the history of the human race going on that you're not read into, you're pissed off, but you're scared. It's frightening, and it is frightening. Now, the Redstone Arsenal, there's a facility there in Alabama associated with the transdimensional research. I've been in one of the labs there, a SCIF, a Secure Communication Information Facility, SCIF. And there are amazing technologies that are being developed there, as well as associated with the Marshall Space Flight Center. The gentleman who's recently surfaced from the Technology Management Office in the sub-basement of the Pentagon said that he went down the Marshall Space Flight Center in this area and was read into the state-of-the-art killer satellite systems that had been put into space that could, and he used the word, obliterate anything in space. And it's very worrisome. Of course, it violates all kinds of treaties, but these are illegal, unacknowledged special access projects. They don't care what the law is. And then you have the Utah complex, not far from Salt Lake City. It's accessible only by air. Dugway Proving Grounds outside Provo has also classified airspace, and underneath Dugway is, I think, probably the most state-of-the-art facility, more so than so-called Area 51 or Edwards, which are older facilities. It also happens to be where the new NSA data center was built. You see this big gleaming multi-$100 million building above ground, but there's a lot beneath ground. And of course, here you get, just a list of the alphabet soup of agencies involved. Air Force, CIA, DARPA, Defense Intelligence. DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, FBI. All branches of the military have various divisions dealing with this. Probably the crown jewel is ONI, also Naval Intelligence and Navy. Earth is 2/3 covered with water, yeah? And we have a lot of assets that are underwater and that are doing things under the oceans connected to ET, and also our own underwater UFOs that are man-made that zip around. NASA has a very compartmented division that deals with this, and the National Reconnaissance Office I mentioned before, they are tasked with all the top secret satellites, but the compartment that deals with this issue would also have the killer satellites and ones with the neutrino light detectors and the weapon systems on them. Of course, the National Security Agency has some compartmented operations dealing with this, and the various space commands, which have now, of course, Trump's calling for the Space Force. The Technology Management Office in the sub-basement of the Pentagon's been around for a long time. It's way deep underneath the Pentagon. It's an unacknowledged area. There's a facility here in Irvine near I-5 and Forest Lakes Boulevard. It looks like an office park, and that's where there's a big underground research facility for the ET bodies. And I mentioned this underground base near Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where there's an ET craft being studied for its cloaking or materialization, dematerialization abilities. And then I mentioned before Seoul, South Korea. The Research Triangle Park in North Carolina has an Army Science Research Center there, Dr. Rayburn Scott and others. What's interesting about that is that, people don't realize that the Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, is the highest number of PhDs anywhere in the world. And there are a lot of classified facilities in that area, in my home state. And I mentioned the NRO neutrino lights, and there are many others. So one of the things that I try to, as I go through all of that, and you get your minds around it, is to understand that it's decentralized It's compartmented, but it's also very scattered into different fiefdoms. So you have a naval fiefdom, and you have an Air Force fiefdom, you have a CIA, and they don't always get along at all right? And then you have, let's go to the next slide, the corporate fiefdoms, sort of feudal warlords. And this is where you get into, of course, a whole lot of companies that you've heard of, some you may not have. BAE Systems, this is British, but they are very involved. BDM Corporation, Bechtel does a lot of the underground base and contracting for these facilities, construction. I actually have met Stephen Bechtel years ago. Booz Allen Hamilton, that's who the contractor was that Snowden worked for, that, you know, but, and then CIA Director Woolsey that I had briefed ended up becoming counsel for, but they are very involved in the ET research area. Boeing has a compartmented operation. EG&G, which has a plant on the edge of the Nellis Range. They do a lot of in fact, the early anti-gravity craft that we built that were man-made were EG&G. This one. E-Systems, which is now part of Raytheon. The brothers, I knew the executives at E-Systems, and they were telling me about the kind of technologies they had that had to do with these electromagnetic weapon systems and mental interface and all kinds of transdimensional systems. And the two brothers that had founded E-Systems were not getting along, and so rather than let that split apart and have the box open up to the public, Raytheon bought them. Lockheed Martin, they have various facilities, including in the Denver Research Center here, has a component that deals with the extraterrestrial research. It's compartmented. McDonnell Douglas has become part of Boeing. MITRE Corporation, North American Rockwell, Northrop, Phillips Lab, Raytheon, TRW, and many others. All these corporations have a piece of the pie, and they get, for example, I know a man who was an auditor for the US government looking into Northrop Grumman's books, and there was a huge amount of unaccounted for spending. And he was told, this is a need-to-know basis. You don't have a need-to-know, so he basically just rubber-stamped the accounting. So what happens is that the money is run a little bit like a mafia. Now, not on this list, and it could be another list, are affiliated criminal enterprises. The key takeaway here is the technologies that sound like, would look like magic that could deceive you and the public have been developed since the 40s and 50s. And so there's in the back of your mind, as things begin to unfold over the next months to a few years, keep that in mind at all times. Keep it in mind at all times. On the other hand, there are extraterrestrial civilizations that are observing this, but we have created a very big problem. And I don't often talk about this, but this is something that certainly those of you doing the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, which is our ambassador team that goes out and makes peaceful contact with these civilizations, needs to know this, is that these civilizations do want to interface with us, but they're likely to interface with us most in these other dimensions, because when they come into 3D, they are tracked, targeted, and hit. Now, we have had one almost disaster at Mount Shasta a few years ago, and we had a luminous light ship that was emerging up from the volcano towards us, and we all got up and were communicating with it, and suddenly we, from a very high altitude airborne craft, there was a burst of energy. Just before that, the ET craft dematerialized, but this energy crashed into the woods about 200 yards in front of us, ripping down all the trees, limbs, and you could hear it, and then it went into the earth 15 seconds shaking the Earth. I was expecting to see a mushroom cloud. Nothing. It was a directional, scalar electromagnetic weapon. But so one of the things that has become a problem is that we're doing this as people wanting to move the planet forward into an era of universal peace and enlightenment, but within the context of all this rubbish. So let's call it the theater of operation. Earth is an armed camp. And so we have to do it with that in our mind. It doesn't stop us. And it most certainly doesn't stop these very advanced ET civilizations from interacting with us, because they can come in a transdimensional form and then materialize briefly and then dematerialize and then communicate with us for hours while we're sitting out in the desert. Happens all the time. Every single week we go out anywhere. Amazing, but it ain't what you think. It's very advanced consciousness and also physics going on. With that, I want to emphasize, I am not saying that all civilizations from other star systems are happy with us. I would say they are quite unhappy. Not with the Earth and humanity per se, but with the direction the planet is going in. That's a big distinction. Because when we first started detonating atomic weapons and then developing these other classified, faster than the speed of light weapons and deploying them into space, this became an existential threat to them. To them. There are planetary systems out there that are interplanetary in their capabilities that don't even have a concept in their bioevolutionary track of war or murder. It's just not there, like we do from monkeys. So we have to understand that if you were to look through ET's eyes and step out into space and look at the last 150 years or 100 years of this planet, where we've gone from, muskets and what have you to thermonuclear weapons and other weapons, and now these USAPs that have these amazingly advanced but potentially interstellar reaching weapon systems, you could understand why they'd be less than amused. Now, this is not to say, don't conflate this as a simplistic statement. It means that there are civilizations out there that are providing a check and a balance. And also they have a plan, another whole plan that's called Plan B. And that is in the event that we cannot get this planet under control and moving on to a level 1 civilization, as Michikaku calls, a peaceful civilization that's not destroying its biosphere, that could be universally at peace on Earth and peace in space, then, and things fall apart here, then there would be the mission to planet Earth to help put it back together. So that's an active program, because it isn't known yet how this is going to play out. It's up to you and me, all of us on planet Earth. They're not going to do it for us. No way. This is in the hands of we, the people. Don't look to the president or the government or the UN. Look to yourselves and your communities of what you can do to create universal peace, make contact with these civilizations, educate each other, and do not a breakaway civilization, but an advanced new civilization that can emerge out of the nonsense of the current culture. That's what we have to see and create.
Can higher civilizations protect us from, like our sun, like a massive coronal mass ejection?
There was a question about any of these civilizations can protect us, if they wish, from anything. Here's the big problem, and I'm glad you asked this question. The reason I met with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency in late 90s, early 2000s, was to read him into these projects that he was being denied access to and give him a warning that our systems on Earth and in space had become so developed that they had become an existential threat to ET operations, and that the ETs for millions of years, and one or few civilizations for upwards of 1 billion years, have been guardians protecting life on Earth. But when we force them too far out of this dimension, then there are things out in space that could be very harmful to us, that could hit us. And it isn't to say that they couldn't then re-emerge, but at their own great peril. So we are putting the planet at risk for things that it has traditionally been protected from that we have very little knowledge of, because we have weaponized these satellite systems in space and also ground-based systems that can reach. So what that means is these technologies in the wrong hands are, it's like, forgive them, they know not what they do. They don't even understand, some of these folks, how reckless and foolish the toys. It's sort of a Strangelovian level. Dr. Strangelove is my reference there. Strangelovian level of madness, like the mad scientists and mad people who are in their own little covert bubble. But there are consequences to doing this. And this is why I wanted to wrap up with a few simple points. The solutions are the disclosure and ethical oversight of these USAP technologies. Now that's a big one, is what we were just talking about. We have to reach a point where these systems and the technologies have an ethical and conscious and enlightened oversight. Without that, it is very dangerous. And that is why the Disclosure Project, why I founded it back in the 90s. Higher states of consciousness. By understanding and entering into these states of consciousness, not only can you know what they're doing, but you can protect yourself and the planet. Because people who come together in prayerful and meditative states have a morphogenic field effect that's enormously protective, beyond what you can imagine, even in the physical domain. This is why they've done studies with intercessionary prayer studies, where they found, people praying with a pure heart for someone who's 1,000 miles away. It has a very amazing effect. And so if people act together in a conscious and enlightened way, it really can put us off the course of destruction onto a path of enlightenment and universal peace. And this is why the next big program we're going to roll out is a global mass awareness of close encounters of the fifth kind. If you understand, I think one time it was called the Maharishi effect, because they'd send meditators into a city and they'd meditate and the crime rates would go down. It only took 1%. So if Denver has 2 million people, then you would need 20,000 people to go there. But what they found is that, and this is also true in physics, is that if you look at, in quantum physics, superfluidity and helium, it only takes about 1% of the molecules becoming coherent in that substrate, in the helium, as it approaches absolute zero. And when 1% is reached, the entire container takes on these magical properties that are where all of them at once go bang, superfluid and coherent. They all align. So don't think that you have to get 99% of the public or 50.1. This is not an election. You need 1% who understand where we are, what the risks are, what the solutions are in consciousness and meditation, peaceful contact, and even these technological solutions moving together. Now, on Earth, that would be about 75 million people. We hope with this next documentary and educational program, we can reach about 100 million people to enter into meditative states together and contact states together, to show these civilizations another face to humanity, an enlightened, peaceful face that can then put us on the path of where we're supposed to have been 100 years ago, and that is universal peace, the ending of poverty, the stabilization of the environment with these wondrous new sciences and technologies that would heal the earth and go forward as an interstellar people peacefully. That's where we're headed, and it's going to take a certain quantum number, but it isn't 99%. It's like 1%. So that's what our next project is. Are there benevolent and forward-thinking allied governments or research organizations? Yes, there are a number that are working to resolve this problem. Here's the issue, is that the center of gravity is mainly U.S., but the way this these programs are structured is that they're transnational. Now, notice I'm using the word transnational rather than international. International would connote something like through the UN, conventional government to conventional government. The management of these operations is that there are satellite programs that are embedded within other countries all over the world. And those are operating under primarily U.S., but not exclusive U.S. Control. Mainly because this is the center of gravity economically, but more importantly technologically, and also military spending. And if you took the top 10 countries in the world besides the U.S., added up their entire defense budgets, it would be less than the U.S. expenditure. So that's one of the big problems, is that the amount of resources that can be siphoned off as sort of a contingency, 10 or 20% contingency, out of U.S. Defense and intelligence and related spending is so large that by itself, our black budget eclipses the next largest country in the world's entire budget. Now, this means that it's very difficult. You know, some years ago, the Ministry of Defense of France was working with us on a CE5 initiative. You all know about the French connection. And we did an expedition to France. The cover story was a training for a group of 60 people out on this estate in Normandy. But you know, one of the senior Minister of Defense officials, Admiral Moran, was there with his assistant, and they had satellite systems and tracking systems set up. And we did the CE5, and they were I have a beautiful document from the French government committing to a long-term, forward-looking effort to make peaceful contact with these civilizations. And it's officially signed. You know, I released that a couple years ago. Those of you who haven't seen it, you should go to our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS disclosure.com, and you know, you have to navigate around, but it's up there. And there are a lot of countries. The problem is that the well-intending people in a few countries, even if they're fairly important G7 countries, have a very difficult time taking on this cabal of operations. Moreover, there are people inside those governments who will sabotage their efforts, and this is a big problem. So one of the things that we're trying to do is bypass government, because, and it's not that I don't think government's important, I just think that it's extraordinarily dysfunctional and broken. And I think it's more likely that the people awakening to this and knowing what the truth is and then taking affirmative, positive steps, such as forming their own interplanetary contact teams through the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, using those protocols, which, you know, people who have just downloaded the app, called the ET Contact tool that we have, you can link to it from our website, on the iTunes store or wherever, have found that they can use those protocols and the remote viewing training that's in that app, go out and they have amazing contact experiences, having never been on one of these week-long expeditions with us. So I think that everyone can empower themselves to do that. As far as governments, what I do now when I have meetings with people in the government and the mainstream is sort of a service, because I feel they have a need to know and they should know. My expectations, however, are rather low that they're going to take the issue on, because they have to bite some very big hands. They have to bite the hands of the most powerful intelligence and military operations in the world that have lethal force. They have to bite the hands of the oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, public utility, macroeconomic, petrodollar, gangbankster system, which they're all nursing on. They're all sort of feeding off that system. Because when you come out with these technologies for peaceful use, you will terminate very quickly hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets. You'll have a new civilization. You'll end poverty. You'll end pollution. You'll have a new world. And if it's used peacefully, you'll have a world that is capable of interplanetary exploration peacefully. However, the stakeholders that are out there and were out there 100 years ago with the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and what have you, they're still out there. But they're, X generations later, but actually more powerful. The centralization of money and power isn't in the governments. It's in the private banking and corporate sector. To give you an idea, the derivatives involved with the trading of commodities alone, the Chicago Board of Trade and Futures, is around $700 or $800 trillion a year. The U.S. federal budget's what, 4 or 5 trillion. Go do the math. Okay, so it's a complicated problem. And I have never met a world leader or a minister of defense or head of an intelligence directorate or MI6 or minister of defense overseas or in this country who wants to try to take that on. Never mind a senator or a congressman. So I think that kind of leadership and courage and integrity has to come from you guys and from us. I think and it's not at all to dismiss government. It's just to say if they want to make themselves irrelevant, and they have, then they'll be irrelevant to the future. If they want to make themselves relevant, they can jump on board at any time. There's a question about, is there any insight on the release of new technologies and what the insiders are saying? I think that there are some people, as I mentioned, there's an initiative out of Salt Lake City that's a private corporation, equity research, that has a anti-grav. What's interesting to me is that is being, it's been intercepted by the intelligence community who at this time are pretending to be friendly to it to support its disclosure as of a month or two ago. Now, what I don't know is if they're going to go through with it, and if they do, how it'll be spun. Because unfortunately, this system is not just a zero-point energy generating system, it's one that they've developed the capability of tapping into these interdimensional fields as well as life forms. And that I've been told is of interest for its psychological warfare value to disclose that as what aliens are. And as distinct from transdimensional extraterrestrial biologicals that are from other star systems. And I think the question is, will that technology be disclosed for purposes that could be good for the human future, or will it be part of a counterintelligence initiative? That's what I'm investigating right now. But I do know it's been fast-tracked and approved. The last I heard, it was for disclosure. I understand here in Colorado, and end of April, early May, they had a week-long meeting with a lot of government and other people to discuss this, and the outcome of which is unknown. So I'm not sure where that's going. I'm hoping that they do not use it in the way that I have been told they intend to, which would be in the direction of really disinforming the public about this. We're always looking for people who have on their own figured out so-called zero-point or technologies. There are some that we're pursuing now up in Canada. So far, we've never found one that passes muster, both technologically but also strategically, meaning that they're willing to have it disclosed on a massive scale on an open source, non-intellectual property basis. What I mean by that is, if you go the IP route, intellectual property route, and the patenting route, it's going to get intercepted. You're going to get a national security order on it. If you go through the conventional funding mechanism, it's also going to be a takedown. There are about 1,000 ways these technologies get ensnared. And every single inventor and investor group that I know that's stepped into this space has fallen into one or more of those traps. So we have a very specific requirement that now, if they need to be financially compensated, there are people that I'm working with who have that ability to do so very easily. And I don't want to, but it's substantial to get it clear to be an open source system. Open source meaning that it would be dumped on the internet, no secrecy, no patent, no intellectual property hold back, massively disclosed. So if someone had $100 million, $20 million could go to acquire and further develop the technology. 80 needs to go into the disclosure of it, so that every man, woman, and child with access to the internet on planet Earth, which is at least half the planet, would know about it. That has to happen, because if it's secret and it's small, it will vanish. And they always vanish. And the team will vanish as well. So we are pursuing that. Speaking personally, I try to avoid technologies that are not, if the holders of the technology, and particularly the money people, don't want to go through that strategic pathway, even if they're compensated, then I don't really want to even know about it, because they're going to all be assassinated. You know, the people who acquired Stan Meyer's material, we were trying to get it through my project, the Orion Project. A group that had more money than we had, because we only had a few $100,000, ended up acquiring it up in Michigan, an engineering group. A couple years later, I get a call from their chief funder, who is Lord so-and-so, I'm not going to say his name here, up in Great Britain. And he says, look, you know, they've gotten these things operational, including Stan Meyer's toroid. And he had a donut-shaped object that had a national security order on it. And that was the main thing we were wanting to get. And this group got it operational. And it was over unity. It was putting out free energy. It had a kind of a liquefied, magnetically charged material in the center of this toroid. And Murder Incorporated came after them. And they were getting death threats and all kinds of problems, all kinds of WSFM, electromagnetic weapon systems. And their fantasy was that they were going to evacuate to an eco-friendly country. I said, you'd have to go to an eco-friendly planet. There is no country on this planet that these henchmen won't find you. So I wrote out a 3-page strategic thing they needed to do instantly to protect themselves and to protect the technology, that included a massive data dump into the internet and a press conference, and getting it out of their own hands in a secretive corporate way. They wouldn't do it, and the last I heard, they've all been assassinated. They're all dead. So I've been through, from 1991 to now, probably dozens of these sort of initiatives. They've all ended in absolute mind-crushing, heartbreaking disasters. I won't do it anymore. It has to be someone who understands what they're up against. And most of the engineering people think, oh, I have a better mousetrap, the world will be the path to my door. No, Murder Incorporated is going to be the path to your door first. Or they think that, you know, I'm going to outwit the intelligence community. I was talking to a guy in Orange County, he had one of these. We're going to put it into 150 different patents, and they won't know what we have. I said, they know what you have already. I've already heard from people at the agency about what you're doing. You have? I said, well, of course, they monitor everything in real time. As soon as you have a device operating that taps into that field, the 0-point field or related, that's picked up by a satellite. The same as if you can set off a nuclear weapon. They know what you have, when you have it, before you have it, or contemporaneously at the same time. I said, you're delusional if you think you're going to trick anyone in the unacknowledged special access project world to have these kinds of technologies and be off the radar. There was another guy up in Canada I met with a year ago, and he said, oh, well, we're going to put it in power plants in Africa, and nobody will know we have it. I'm going, oy vey. Where's a rock? I'm going to kill myself right now. You know, it's just like so completely ridiculous, because they just don't understand strategically what they're up against. And this is the Achilles heel of people who are brilliant engineers or even brilliant financiers. They think it's like coming out with a new version of an iPhone. No, it isn't. You're coming out with something that's going to terminate hundreds of trillions of dollars of oil, gas, coal, banking, petrodollar, etc., macroeconomic power. Not just money, power. Those folks are going to do everything within their ability to stop you. So you have a handful of petro-Nazis and gangbangsters who want this stopped, but you have 7.5 billion people who'll be on your side. Give it to the people. So that's my message. There's a way to do it. It's a heavy lift, and even then it's dangerous. Now, frankly, I think that the first level of disclosure on those technologies needs to be a stationary, in other words, sit on your table here or sit out where your heat pump is. That would be an energy generating system. I think that the things that are teleportation or anti-grav and what have you that can be weaponized into a missile delivery system needs to be a second level of disclosure in terms of an applied technology, because obviously anything like that can be applied by anyone once they have the knowledge into a weapon delivery system. And that gets into this other big question of what are we going to do when we grow up as a people? You know, I mean, we're stuck in the 1800s paradigm with our energy and technology. Don't fool yourself with all your little computer gadgets. I mean, everything this planet is running on is circa 1800s, late 1800s. Oil, gas, coal, even nuclear is mid-1900s. So if we want to move on to a level 1 civilization, this has to come out. But it cannot come out if it's going to be used in a weaponized way. So we have to have an evolution of consciousness and the structures within society to have, let's call it an enforceable peace. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but where we maintain the world in a stable, peaceful state so that these technologies can be used safely to then transform the world from a place that's collapsing environmentally, but also in terms of the suffering and poverty on the planet, and can be transformed into a prosperous, abundant, stable environment, clean environment. And the earth, she is a conscious living being, and she will be able to heal herself very quickly if we stop abusing her. But we keep abusing her. And we have to lift the burden from the earth, and these sciences and technologies would do it. But it's not a step forward if we bring the technologies out and then they're applied to be put into a different and new weapon system. Now, in all honesty, that's what's already happened. Between 1940s and now, the most advanced of these technologies are in the absolute worst possible hands, many of them, and who are not being overseen by we the people or our government of we the people or by any accountable agency. And what that means is the people who are the holders and controllers of those systems, it's sort of checkmate. And this gets into a really deep problem. One of the things that happened when I was briefing the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff, Admiral Wilson, he was very upset about all of this. And he had made an inquiry into these projects prior to my meeting with him, and I did what's called a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon for him. And astronaut Edgar Mitchell was with me and a few other people. I was teaching Edgar Mitchell about these things. And when I was in this briefing, at the end, I said, we really need your help, Admiral, in disclosing this information and getting these technologies under control and into folks like you, the white hats, which is most of the people in the military intelligence community are very good people, actually. But we need your help. And he says, well, what am I going to do? I've learned that there are groups that are denying me access, because he had tried to access one of these unacknowledged compartmented projects, and they said, sir, we will not read you into this, and hung up on him. He says, but they won't let me in, and the best thing I have that I know about is the B-2 stealth, and they have things that are 100 generations further along that are anti-grav and can do circles around my B-2 stealth. It's point, set, match. He says, I've been checkmated, number one. Number two, he said, who else have you met with who is being denied access like I am? I said, well, the current director of the CIA and the president and the Secretary of Defense, Cohen, and people like that. And he said, well, what the hell am I going to do? If I don't get an order from the civilian commanders, then I'm going rogue. How do I get control of it? And they won't give me the order because they're scared shitless. That's when I realized between 93 and 97, 98, we have to do this. So, and we have to bring out the sciences, the technologies, the information, and also be the ambassadors of peace to these civilizations. That's what has to happen.